Well, earlier this week, a pro-Brexit group of economists came up with their own assessment of the economic impact of leaving the EU. Julian Jessop contributed to that report from Economists for Free Trade. Vicky Pryce is a former government economist. Well, of course, we were all glued to the Jacob Rees-Moggs, weren't we, behind there in that last film. Julian Jessop, your model assumes a mass elimination of tariffs. Has any government minister or political party indicated they would unilaterally eliminate all tariffs?
Well, not as such, but I think that's a reasonable approximation for where the government wants to end up, which is a situation where we have a comprehensive free trade deal with the rest of the European Union, covering both goods and services, and significantly lower trade barriers with the rest of the world. It's true that the government isn't intending to completely eliminate barriers. In order to make our assumptions, we've always had another scenario where they only eliminate roughly half of them, and that still delivers a positive number. But whichever way you look at it, you do end up in our scenarios with positive numbers rather than negative. Right,
but you've admitted that you don't think anybody has actually put that scenario forward, the first one. I mean, has any other country or bloc indicated they'd be interested in removing tariffs and non-tariff barriers to the extent that you'd like to see?
Well, I think as a starting point, we have to model what the government is actually aiming to achieve. And we can have a separate argument about whether or not this scenario is likely to be accepted by the rest of the European Union or the rest of the world. But the problem, I think, with the Treasury analysis is that it basically models three scenarios, none of which are actually government policy. And in particular, the one that features on the bus is something that the government has pretty much ruled out as well. So I think it's important to look at a range of scenarios rather than prejudge the outcome of the negotiations haven't even started yet.
What do you say in response to that, Vicky Pryce?
Well, it's interesting that they've come up with a positive figure in the medium to long term, and we are really talking long term here.
And what is the medium to long term?
Well, I mean, like you have
2030,
right, as the period that you're looking at. And but of course, you know, it could take longer for any positives to come through. And in the long term, as we all know, we're all dead. But the interesting thing is that they're not saying very much about the short term, which is likely to be very disruptive. I think even those economists who put this together accept that there are going to be issues in the transition from where we are to a free trade area in terms of eliminating trade barriers when others haven't necessarily done so. That's going to be very difficult. The second thing is that, of course, any trade agreement we may have with anyone else is unlikely to cover services, and quite a lot of countries that would like to talk to us about this, like India, would like in return to be allowed to freely come and live here and work here. And of course, it's something the UK is never going to allow.
Do you sign up broadly to the Treasury analysis in terms of the scenarios that they used to say that growth would be slower or the economy would grow less quickly in the future?
What I sign up to is that if you remove frictionless trade with our major trading partner, after all, we still sell 45% of our goods and services to them, and services are very important. If you make that less frictionless and you reduce, therefore, the ability to sell to those countries the way we did before, it increases costs, it reduces growth. And therefore, that in itself is a very good starting point. Anything you do to reduce the impact you may have, in other words, anything that allows you to stay as close as you are to where you are at present would, of course, mean that you're not doing as badly as you would otherwise do.
Right. I mean, do you agree that you are talking about the medium to long term? And if we are talking about 15 years of slower growth or a smaller economy, that is something that is going to impact negatively on the British public?
Well, as far as the short term is concerned, of course, the Treasury published a report 2 years ago suggesting that a vote to leave would prompt an immediate recession. So I think our track record on predicting the short term is pretty good.
Right, but what is your prediction for the short term?
Well, we're not making, in this report, a prediction for the short term. I think a lot will depend on a couple of things. One, for example, is what sort of transitional arrangements are made. The second is what sort of adjustment mechanisms are put in place. For example, to protect agriculture, if we're going to remove agricultural subsidies, or manufacturing sectors where there may need to be retraining. But those are in the short term, and you know, if we're looking at the longer term, once those adjustment costs have been worked through, we'd expect a big positive.
Right. I mean, what about the cost to consumers of Brexit? Because there are now, or there have always been, these two different positions. We heard Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that actually if we don't have a clean or pragmatic Brexit, the term that he'd used, the cost for consumers will actually go up.
But one of the main benefits of being in this huge regional free trade area has been that, in fact, consumer prices have been kept low. We have now inflation finally reappearing, mainly because of our exchange rate having gone down. But overall, we've had a period of very low inflation. We have no tariffs. The trade barriers are practically non-existent, which means actually there are no costs to industry. And when you make, I mean, the EU's benefit is that it has forced firms to take advantage, if you like, of economies of scale, to take advantage of the fact that you can now move things easily from one country to another, take advantage of the fact that there's open skies and airline costs have gone down significantly, and so on. The consumer has been the main beneficiary of being there. On the other side, obviously, and I think that was the point that you were trying to
Well,
ask.
the common external tariff has meant in Jacob Rees-Mogg's mind, whether it's right or wrong, that actually clothing and some food is more expensive.
Oh, well, it's absolutely true that there are tariffs against various countries and various products that keep some prices high, but that's compensated significantly by the low prices we pay for other things. And there is no expectation that we're going to be reducing those tariffs to zero or considerably, because that would basically eliminate our agricultural sector. It would probably eliminate our manufacturing sector too, and I think overall the consumer at the end of the day would suffer because of lower growth and higher unemployment.
Do you accept that the compensation outweighs the model that has been outlined by Jacob Rees-Mogg, or do you agree with him completely?
Well, on this matter at least, I'm with Jacob. I think the key point here is that a lot of the things that are being modelled are actually completely in the hands of the government. So when you get a big negative, it's often because you assume that in the absence of a deal, the British government would impose tariffs on imports from the European Union. In practice, it could maintain the level playing field required under the rules of the World Trade Organization by lowering tariffs on trade with the rest of the world, which would be a clear positive. Now, there will be winners and losers from this, but the winners far outweigh the losers, and it's possible to compensate the losers and still be better off.
Right, OK, well, let's have a look at the idea of compensation, because if we go back to the Treasury analysis, for a free trade deal, for example, with America to make up for lost trade with the EU, then those civil service estimates and economists will not just have to be wrong, they'll have to be wrong by a factor of 40. For the estimated 0.2% growth from the US trade deal to make up for the lost 8% in trade from the EU. Do you accept that?
I think both those numbers fail the common sense test. I mean, our exports to the EU are only 12% of GDP, and somehow the hit will be as much as 8% if we have even a relatively small increase in frictions.
Okay, well, as I'm saying, but we're talking about wrong by a factor of 40. I mean, do you accept that that is still quite a large measure to be wrong by?
Well, if you look at the past track record of the Treasury in forecasting, then it seems quite reasonable to forecast that sort of error.
Well, and on that, Treasury forecasting has not been accurate. It has not got a good track record. And it is true that economic Armageddon was predicted in the immediate aftermath of that referendum vote, and it hasn't been realised.
The first thing I would say that Treasury forecasting, if you look back through the years, has not been bad at all. In fact, there many times they've been considerably better than the independent forecasters. The second thing is that, of course, we haven't left the EU yet. Brexit hasn't happened, and also there was a huge increase of liquidity into the system by the Bank of England, and lower interest rates and quantitative easing and special help for loans to enterprises and consumers. They've all benefited from that, and that's why the economy has kept going. Plus, of course, the fall in the pound. So there have been temporary factors. What's going on right now is that whereas the rest of the world is growing very fast, we're growing at the lowest rate of the G7.
Before I come to our other guests, Julian, Jessop, you claim that border costs would be zero. I mean, is there any border in the world where costs are zero, except the borders between countries of the single market?
OK, to be precise, that is what we call a modelling assumption.
Right.
We're assuming that...
A bit like the Treasury one.
Exactly. It's an assumption, but I actually think it's more reasonable than the Treasury's assumption, because over time, border costs are falling, for example, because of technological progress. It's increasingly easy to move goods across borders without having to face large costs. And we see that not just in the UK, but worldwide. In contrast, the Treasury is forecasting that there'll be a big increase in border costs and a very substantial knock-on effect from the amount of trade that we're doing. So, as it happens, if you did add in a small amount back into our modelling for border costs, you would still produce positive results. But ironically, our assumption, I think, of zero border costs is actually more accurate than what the Treasury has got.